But I'll tell you what they don't want. They don't want a population of citizens capable of critical thinking. They don't want well-informed, well-educated people capable of critical thinking. They're not interested in that. That doesn't help them. That's against their interest.
To tell what I knew of activities which I believe might lead to an attempt to set up a fascist dictatorship.
Now, to go on to the word fascism, I would describe the type of government into which we have evolved as essentially fascist, yes.
It lays the predicate and the foundation for the development of a weather satellite that will permit man to determine the world's cloud layer and ultimately to control the weather, and he who controls the weather will control the world.
Trust the experts, trust the experts. Trust the science, trust the science. CDC, CDC, Dr. Fauci, Dr. Fauci. Mask on, mask off, 2 shots, 1 shot, mask on, 2 masks. Comply, comply.
Welcome to the Exit Your Matrix show, where we take the deep dive in search of truth. On the journey, we examine critical topics such as natural law, consciousness, morality, individual sovereignty, and the occult. And here's your host, Brad Villers. Hello and welcome to the Exit Your Matrix show. This is episode number 5. For those who have been here before, welcome back. For those of you who are here for the first time, welcome. Now, I have taken a little bit of time off. For those of you who have seen some prior work, took a little hiatus, but I am back and I will be here on a regular basis. So thanks for hanging in there and being back. And if you get some value from the show, I hate to sound like all the other people on YouTube, but if you will hit that subscribe button below in the bottom right, that would help. That gets this information out there. So I first want to start with a quote, and this comes to us from Manly P. Hall and his book, his greatest work of many, and it's called The Secret Teachings of All Ages. And if you ever get the opportunity to own this book, it's a real treat. I'm reading this right now with a good friend of mine. This is not a copy of mine. Mine looks a little bit different, but the 2 shots there that you see on the left and right, I probably could have done a little bit nicer job formatting that, but you get the picture. Those are actual photos from my version of the book, and it has some incredible illustrations. And then you can see, of course, Manly P. Hall up there at the top right. So he said this, and this is in his writings about Hermes and Hermetic principles, and a chapter dedicated to him. Hermes next inquired about the road by which the wise man attained to life eternal, and Poimandres continued, quote, "Let the man endued with a mind mark, consider, and learn of himself, and with the power of his mind divide himself from his not-self, and become a servant of reality," end quote. So I thought that was an interesting way to start off today, and certainly is all about the message of this show, which is using your mind, first and foremost, before we get into any other principles or concepts. So today we're going to talk about worldviews. Before we get to that, though, I would like to cover some themes, macro themes, and these are some things that I just want to kind of make sure we're all on the same page about before we get into it. So first of all, I'm doing this because I am concerned about how we are going along in this world and where we are headed. I'm further concerned that we lack a basic understanding of ourselves. We lack a fundamental knowledge of who we are as human beings, our human nature, and I'm concerned that there are people who would use that knowledge, and they have that knowledge in spades versus the average person. They use that to their advantage and against us for purposes of control and for consumerism and religion and all sorts of different things. So I'm doing this just because I'm hoping this is a contribution to greater thinking, greater amounts of awareness and consciousness, and people taking up, I think, some more serious topics than the big game that's coming on, or some social media, or consumerism, or shopping, or whatever it is. So that's why I'm here. That's the only reason, is just to try to spread some information that I have come across that I find to be truthful, to be very insightful. And then I challenge you to do your own thinking and make your own conclusions based upon what I've shared and decide for yourself. So, first off, the one thing I want to get across, if nothing else, out of this whole adventure, and that is I want more people to do their own thinking. I want you to do your own thinking. And I think we often think that we do that, but then when we start to look into it, actually we're so controlled by our upbringing and our conditioning and education and all of these things that we just really have no understanding of, and they're very powerful and potent. So number one, do our own thinking, and whatever comes of that is okay, but we have to start with that. So I would make this analogous to a journey, and so on any journey you're going to run into roadblocks, and the first test, the first real big obstacle that we run into in our journey towards truth and understanding the laws of nature and the universe that govern our behavior and what goes on is that we have to navigate our own minds. That's the first big obstacle. And so what I'm really trying to get across here is that while we will talk about specific concepts and ideas, so natural law, occultism, objective morality, all of these things which I believe exist and are true, but before we get to those, really the key is you have to be able to go through the process and the journey of opening your mind to this information. And I believe that the process and the journey is actually where the action is. Sure, we can get to conclusions, but if we haven't trained our minds in how to deal with this information and this knowledge, getting the information at the very end is not going to be very helpful. We have to understand the process of how to go through that information and parse it, make our own conclusions about it, and be investigators. So right now I'd like to go to something that I put together, which is, it's my own, so it might have some weaknesses here, but what I tried to do was come up with some basic tenets, and I call them the tenets of the receptive mind. And these are basically 7 things that, in my opinion, are critical to us being able to have the right mental capacity is maybe not a good word, but the mental framework and the mental mindsets to be able to deal with some of this information. So first of all, do your own thinking. I've talked about that at length. Number 2, exercise discernment. And I think this is critically important in the area of the information that we take in. What is that information? And probably more importantly, what are the sources of that information? You've got to be very careful, and you have to make sure that not only you are being cautious, but that you get a wide variety of information from sources that you probably would otherwise not pay attention to. Number 3, practice pedestal thinking. So I got this from a museum here locally that has a permanent exhibit of geodes and gems and things like that, and they put them under these pedestals with the glass around it and the light coming from the top. Looks really cool. And you can walk around it and look at it from all different angles. And the concept is the same. Take an idea or a thought or a concept and be able to put it on a pedestal, not have any connection to it, not have any emotional investment in it, and be able to examine it just from afar. Number 4, understand cognitive dissonance. Now, I think this one is important because I think there may be some confusion about cognitive dissonance. Maybe it's my own. But some folks say that cognitive dissonance is the existence of contradictory ideas in the mind. And I don't think that is complete. I think it's actually what results from those 2 contradictory pieces of information. And it's described here, I think, pretty well. It's the perception of contradictory information and the mental toll of it. And I think that's the critical part. And then it goes on to say, cognitive dissonance is typically experienced as psychological stress when persons participate in an action that goes against one or more of these things. So that's when they actually are behaving contradictory to what they hold to be true. In either case, the idea that I'm trying to get across here is to be able to hold 2 conflicting or contradictory ideas and not have cognitive dissonance result. Be able to get to the state where we can hold these things in our mind and just evaluate them for the sake of evaluating them. Number 5, allow and ultimately welcome anarchy of the mind. So this is essentially a parallel to anarchy that we hear talked about in society, but it's in our minds, just as it implies here. What we're saying is for there to be no ruler of the mind, for there to be no master of the mind, and to allow the mind to go where it goes. And at first, that's hard, and that's why I use the word allow, but then ultimately you want to be able to welcome it, because then a totally different state comes over you, and the ability to entertain different information, new information, the interest in seeking that information all of a sudden starts to blossom. Number 6, recognize the impact of conditioning and external influences. I alluded to this earlier. We have to understand that we are a product of all of the millions and millions of interactions that we've had and decisions we have made and have had made for us, and our upbringing and the parenting that we received and the influence of teachers and public or other education. The list goes on and on, but those things are very real, and we have to be aware of them. And we also have to be aware of external influences in the terms of propaganda, advertising, and the like. Finally, this is possibly the most important, although I think do your own thinking is still the most important. But embrace being able to say, I was wrong and I don't know. Those are 6 very powerful words, infrequently spoken, but they will go a long way in creating an environment where it's much easier to accept this information and be able to properly go about a journey towards truth. So one thing I want to talk about is how I'm different. There are a lot of great shows out there, great sources of information, ones that I'm often listening to, and they do awesome stuff. I get a lot of inspiration and a lot of content from them. However, one thing I think that's going on is the whodunit episode, which is many folks trying to figure out who's at the top of the pyramid. And so I found this, and I thought this was a really nice display here to be able to show. I actually went out and typed in conspiracy pyramid, and this jumped up. But we see this, right? Or perhaps you've seen it. And this is fascinating, by the way. I have no issue with this. This is very interesting. As humans, I think we have a natural inclination to want to understand this information and know what the source of this is. But I don't think it's where the real game is. I really think that if we work toward achieving the tenets that I talked about earlier, we change in a way that organically leads us to truth, but it's the process, as I talked about, not just where we get, but how we get there. It is this process that gives us exposure to some really sublime insights, some ideas, some ways of thinking, and changes us for the better. So really what I'm saying there is I believe that truth is a byproduct of the process of freeing the mind. So Mark Passio runs the website whatonearthishappening.com, and he makes on that site a really incredible offer that I think you should take him up on. And that is, if you will send him a 2 terabyte hard drive, all the instructions are on his website, he will send you back that same drive chock full of information. And you can see here a list of the thousands of pieces of data in terms of audio files, interviews, videos, books. This is an incredible repository of knowledge. And in fact, ARC stands for the Amazing Repository of Knowledge. It is really incredible. I have it. I listened to an episode of Mark's podcast recently, and he said that he's almost not able to keep up with the number of requests for the drive, which I think is great. But if you want to see some of these eclectic sources of information that I'm talking about, please go there, get this ARC drive, and start listening to some of the stuff, reading this stuff, watching this stuff. It's really incredible, and it will definitely challenge your preconceived notions of what you thought was correct and what you thought was true. Another fundamental belief I have is that our condition, where we are now or where we have ever been, it's uniquely related to us and our functions as humans. So we have wants, we have needs, we have weaknesses, our minds work in a certain way, we have a certain psyche and psychology. They're fascinating things that we don't know about, but they're uniquely human. But they have led us, for whatever reason, to want to trade sovereignty for comfort and perceived safety. That is the key. We want to trade sovereignty for comfort and perceived safety. Now, if you ask anyone, are you willing to give up your rights? They would probably initially say no, but then we see things like the Patriot Act, and we see all of these other, the slipping of our rights and our liberties, and we start to understand that there is a way that that can be done, and it's when we are offered comfort and safety. So we have to understand and really let that sink in. It's an essential belief of mine. And now on that subject, I wanted to go back maybe and revisit the conspiracy pyramid a bit as well, and talk about what is really going on and really who's to blame. And I found this excellent op-ed recently that I wanted to share. This is from the Epoch Times. So he starts with this quote: "Government, like dress, is the badge of lost innocence. The palaces of kings are built upon the ruins of the bowers of paradise." And that's from Common Sense in 1776 by Thomas Paine. So the component of the letter that I thought was really impactful is this: "But I understand completely how it happened. You and I let it happen. We were too busy to get involved, busy trying to survive, and lacking the resources of individual or collective wealth, with little or no time to involve ourselves in the successful protests of their greedy ways, we have, in fact, allowed them to fashion the noose that is planned for our eventual hanging. As that famous denizen of the swamp Pogo once said, we have met the enemy, and it is us. As is usually the case, to find the cause of most of our problems, simply look in the mirror." He continues, "Get involved. No longer accept victim status. Do whatever you think you should, often, but don't continue to do nothing. They're counting on that." Well, thank you to the person who sent that letter in. I think that was an amazing piece and really hit the nail on the head. We can look for the actors playing their parts, and they certainly probably are. But in the end, we have to look at ourselves and our own actions and lack of action that has really caused this to happen and for us to be in the situation that we're in. So now I want to turn to a piece that came out when a gentleman by the name of John Rappaport introduced a new podcast that's specific to imagination. And just really quickly, brief bit of background on John. He is a longtime writer. He was an investigative journalist for about 30 years. He wrote the book AIDS, Inc., which I'll actually refer to later. Has a great website, nomorefakenews.com, sends out daily blog posts. It's really good stuff. Highly suggest you check him out. One of the goats, as far as I'm concerned, in the truth and higher consciousness and elevated thinking kind of sphere. So he said the following about imagination. "For the past few thousand years, Earth culture has done everything in its power to downplay and bury and distort the power of imagination. This is more than an elite operation. It's an effort of the rational mind to take charge of all aspects of life under the assumption that there is no other way for humans to survive. To say this is a mistake is like saying failing to eat or breathe air is a mere mistake. The vast overreach of the rational mind has imposed incredible limits on the individual human being. The truth is, the individual certainly does need the rational logical mind. It is essential. But it is not everything. Left to its own devices, without a partner, it eventually becomes destructive, because it comes to resemble a machine. And humans have an astounding ability not to notice they are beginning to think and act like machines, in patterned and repetitive ways. But when humans finally open the door wide to their own imaginations, the whole basis of living shifts." So I'd like to start with a recap of the information that we've covered to date. And again, I'd encourage you to go back and start at episode 1 and come forward from there. Of course, there aren't that many episodes, so that shouldn't take you too long. But we're building a base of knowledge and building upon it as we move towards more sophisticated concepts like natural law and objective morality. So the first thing is truth. We are naturally wanting to highlight, and our goal is ultimately truth. And truth we will see through the lens of not only the things we're learning as we go, but when we do really reach that pay dirt of natural law and of objective morality, those kinds of things, that's really where it's going to take form. Our goal is along the way to find truth and to seek it. But we also need to be careful and watch out for a worldview and a thought pattern that is very dangerous, and that is solipsism. And I'll repeat that word over and over again. You'll hear it a lot, but I now can't get the word solipsism out of my head just because I've heard it so many times, in this case from Mark Passio's work. But solipsism is basically the idea that truth can't be known. And I think the most popular version of this, and probably the best version that we know about, is the old adage of perception is reality. Oh, well, perception's reality. Well, actually it's not. Reality is reality, and our view of it and what our particular take on that is really immaterial to truth and to what's going on objectively around us. The next is cause and effect. Huge topic. And it goes back to that conspiracy pyramid I showed you before. A lot of people would look at that and say, that's the cause, or the causes are on that. And again, I would say, no, we need to go back to the Epoch Times op-ed piece. And that's really the cause, which is us, and the effect that we're feeling of lack of solidarity with our fellow human being, and divisiveness, and war, and slavery, and debt slavery, and a monetary system that is as crushing as it is. But we see all of this play out in that world, but we really need to focus on true cause, right? And we see this in other places. I think a great place to see this playing out is, I guess, what we would ostensibly call health or health care, but is really medicine. And that is that we are not looking in traditional Western medicine for causes. We are just treating symptoms or effects. And I think that's a great example of it. So many things to alleviate pain and to alleviate the thing that ails us, but that is really just pointing to something that's more fundamental that we typically don't deal with. We've talked about aspects of manifested consciousness. So those are the 3 components of thoughts, emotions, and actions. And not only what they are, but how important it is that they're aligned, that they are harmonious. Brain composition. As you'll see, I've used this before, and this is the depiction of the triune brain, or the 3 brains in one. So we start with the reptilian brain, also referred to as the brain stem. And this is essentially fight or flight. So talking about instinctive behaviors, as the slide shows here, essential body functions and the like. These are the base components of staying alive. Next, we move to the limbic system, or the mammalian brain, and this is where we see the introduction of emotions. And finally, the neocortex, cortex, or the thinking or human brain. And this is where we get into very complex things like perception, planning, attention, abstract thinking, language, the thinking of oneself, metaphysics. We also have to look at the structure of the brain, specifically the neocortex, in its left and right hemispheres. So as we look at this diagram, one of my favorites, the left brain, picture tells 1,000 words, right? Black and white. So you see numbers and letters there. And this is the side of the brain that controls language, mathematics, linear thinking, more concrete items, I would say. More quote-unquote black and white thinking. Then on the right, you see this splash of colors. And so immediately I think artistic, but creativity is the word that they've used here, intuition, empathy, holistic thinking, visualization. These are all components of the right brain and its operation. We've talked about the two primary and primal forces within us, and those are love, which expands consciousness, and fear, which constricts consciousness. And so what we have is both love and fear showing themselves, manifesting themselves in our world. And so when we have love showing itself internally, manifesting internally, we view that and describe that as sovereignty or dominion. When love is expressed externally or manifests externally, we see that as freedom. Conversely, when we have fear within us, that is confusion, and fear externally is control, or more appropriately, slavery. So now to the topic for today, and that is worldviews. And so what we have are worldviews that result from imbalances of that left-right brain hemisphere. So if we have imbalances to the left brain, and remember that's this black and white, linear thinking, mathematics, science, we have a condition that is called randomness. And this is the concept that everything is a cosmic accident, the Big Bang Theory and the like. And just 3 days ago, probably, I found this video by Eric von Daniken, and if you haven't heard about him, you should check him out. By the way, I tell you, there's a ton of Eric von Daniken work on the ARC drive. So if you order that, you'll be set on Eric von Daniken stuff. But you can go to YouTube. He's got his own channel. It's some incredible stuff. And it will probably blow your mind. But I want you to listen to what he has to say about this very specific aspect of randomness, specific to this concept of a cosmic accident.
I have learned in school that it all started on Earth with this primordial soup. Some atoms come together and form molecules, etc. In the meantime, modern science says no. The information of life came from outside.
So another description of randomness would be that we're meat sacks. I don't know if you've heard anybody say that. We're just this compilation of cells and neurons and electricity, and it fires and it does a bunch of stuff that it does. There's nothing inherently spiritual about it. There is nothing inherently even sometimes emotional about it. It's just a physiological process based upon the composition of the body and tissues and blood and all those workings. Randomness holds that there is no underlying intelligence in nature. So there is no such thing as laws which govern creation. Natural law, completely off the table, of course. And randomness is based in solipsism. We talked about this earlier, and it's the idea that truth cannot be known. Objective reality can't be really pointed to and observed and identified. Again, perception is reality. So what you have here is the ultimate outcome of randomness, and this solipsistic attitude is atheism and scientism. Now, scientism is something I'm pretty interested in, especially what we've gone through over the last 3 years. And I wanted to introduce some audio of John Rappaport again, who I quoted from earlier. And he was on a podcast, and he was talking about what I'm calling scientism. He did not use that term, but I think the description that you'll hear will give you an idea of what I'm talking about. And so just to give this a little bit of a setup, this was a talk that he gave to an audience and that he's talking about. He's going to describe what kind of played out, but he was presenting to this audience the results of his research and findings from a book that he was writing called AIDS Inc. And essentially he was really drilling down on the apparent connection or the supposed connection between HIV and AIDS, and also actually what AIDS was. And he had some fundamental questions about that. And so he starts presenting to this group, and then here's the description of what he says happens next.
So as soon as I stood up and started talking, I realized that all the people there were looking more and more disgruntled as I continued to lay out the case that I made in my book. And I don't think I brought it up during the talk because these were in the early years, let us say, when I didn't have as much experience as I do now. But I realized at some point what was going on. Because they were atheists, they had, quote, a deep and firm and abiding belief in science, end quote. See, that was the solution. That was the grand solution, sort of, to humanity's problems. But they were unable to differentiate between pseudoscience and real science. So they considered, just off the cuff, that whatever the science establishment or the medical establishment was saying about AIDS and HIV had to be true because that was science, right? So therefore, for me to begin to not only question but heavily criticize in my usual sarcastic way, point by point, the insane research that led up to saying that HIV caused AIDS was me attacking science. That was their bias. That's the lens that they were looking through as I spoke. And that's why they were pissed off and not happy at all. So there's a case, you see, where something enters into these groups. That's just an example of one. They develop their own bias, their own prejudice, their own whatever, their own point of view, you could call it. But from that point of view, that's going to give birth to a number of blind spots where they can't think straight, where they can't look at what is being put in front of them. They're always going to see it through that particular lens in general terms, not specific terms, just kind of, well, this is the enemy, that kind of thing, right? And this is what happens to most of these groups.
And so I think that does a fair job of not exactly describing scientism, but putting it in the framework of when a group begins to think in certain terms and starts to vest in that belief system absolute certainty that it cannot be wrong, that it cannot be questioned, and that any ideas or thoughts that might be contrary or might call that into question have to be rejected. This is also based on old Newtonian science, right? So very strict laws, has no conceptualization of the workings of the psyche, of consciousness, of anything else. And an ideology that grows out of randomness is moral relativism. And this is the concept that there really is no right or wrong. One should have total freedom to decide what they want based upon their interpretation and beliefs about what's going on. So it doesn't matter what the impact is on someone else, as long as that individual is able to pursue what they think is correct and true and right based upon their own perceptions of reality. Now, the final conclusion here is that's social Darwinism. So that's the survival of the fittest in the sense of human beings and how they operate, which is a very, very concerning concept, right? And this comes from individuals believing that they can determine truth for themselves, that there is no universal law, no natural law that governs truth and reality. It's up to us as individuals to just make that up as we go along. Ultimately, the mindset of the individual engaged in this left brain imbalance called randomness is an order giver or a master mindset. Conversely, if one has a strong imbalance to the right hemisphere of the brain, then we have a resulting condition called determinism. And this is essentially that God or source or energy or whatever you want to call it has preordained everything. It's all been decided. Free will does not exist in this model, And our decisions are initiated by God. So if they're initiated by God, they certainly aren't controlled by us. In this thinking, in this mindset, change is impossible. So why question anything? Why wonder about anything? And certainly why act to change anything? Because action is meaningless. Everything has already been decided and it's just playing out according to a cosmic plan. And a hallmark of determinism is religious extremism or religious fundamentalism. And finally, the mindset that results in this right brain imbalance of determinism is the order follower or slave mentality. So as we wrap this up, it's important to understand that people with either of these mindsets will say outwardly, if asked, that they want freedom, they champion sovereignty, they champion peace, but their mindsets and these imbalances that they have are entirely inconsistent with the attainment of those goals. And their thoughts, emotions, and actions, those three components of consciousness, are clearly divided and not aligned. Now, there are deterministic and randomness elements of our reality. So it's not to say that while we're picking on determinism and randomness, these things do appear in our reality, but they just don't appear in terms of left or right brain imbalances. So truth is the deterministic element in our world through natural law, which is expressed through things like natural law principles, the 7 Hermetic principles, for example. And these cannot be denied or overcome. And the randomness element of our world is free will. So we do see determinism and randomness in the world, but we just don't see them through those imbalances that we talked about. So thanks for being here. Hope you got some good information out of it. Again, if you enjoyed the show, hit that subscribe button. I would appreciate it. And I want to give you a little hint about our next show. Now, I know the audio is not the best here, but I have to try to get past the copyright police, so I cranked up the volume. I think you'll be able to hear it, but we'll take it away with this one. Thanks and be well.
I noticed you've had a great year. Good boy. You turning that money into more money?
Are you referring to alchemy?